All right, so very small introduction to Beethoven. You could go on forever when talking about Beethoven. He is by far the most recorded and most popular composer of all time, and his popularity doesn't seem to wane. Uh, in reality, he's kind of our first ever freelance artist. He breaks the bonds of patronage in many, many ways and becomes kind of a superstar. Beethoven was born in 1770. He dies in 1827. 20,000 people attend his funeral. Very few people attended Mozart's funeral. He was broke and destitute and had kind of fallen out of favor, unfortunately, at the end of his life, and kind of had some notorious behaviors himself that made people not endeared to him. But in the beginning of the 19th century, there's a change in the view of a composer as craftsman until a composer, or into the idea of composer as genius. So in the time of Bach, Bach was seen very much as a craftsman, someone who takes an idea and physically builds it, like a well-designed furniture, or like a well-crafted piece of furniture from the Baroque. Again, music is still not on the same level of the visual arts and other arts of the time. It was still seen as a craft and a skill more so than the other arts. Now, at the beginning of the 19th century, this begins to change, and Beethoven's part of the reason. The idea that now composer as craftsman becomes composer as artistic genius. This new view is that an artist suffers for humanity and that music is an art on the highest level. And in the next time period, the Romantic era, it gets to the point where music becomes the most ideal of all of the arts because it is not bound by physical space like painting or sculpture or landscape architecture, and it's not bound by mechanical time. So it's outside of space, it's outside of time. It can be truly abstract and expressive. It is outside of physical reality, and it does not necessarily have to have literal translation, as we'll figure out. So Beethoven is clearly in the classical era, although he lives into Romanticism. He's never actually attached to it in reality, because Romanticism is a literary movement, and Beethoven was not really tied into those ideas. But Beethoven embodies the concept of artist as genius. He's the only composer in our book that gets his own chapter. It's true of almost every music appreciation book that Beethoven gets his own chapter. He composed 9 symphonies before he died. He's known for his piano sonatas and his symphonies. He rarely wrote something that was not a big hit. The only thing probably would be his opera. He wrote one opera, and it's frankly just not that good. It wasn't where his skill sets were. Beethoven was unmarried for his entire life, although he had sort of numerous love affairs with women. He had a very angry and stoic personality and could be kind of hard to get along with. He had a medical condition that leads to his ultimate deafness. In 1802, he writes this famed letter, which is now called the Helgenstadt Testament, where he's considering what his life as a conductor and as a pianist and as a composer will be as a deaf person. The disorder he has, there's no timeline for when he'll go deaf. He could wake up totally deaf. It could take 20 years. Wasn't really well known. And so he's working out these ideas of what his life would be like as an artist if he were deaf. There's no American Sign Language. Obviously, this time people were treated very, very poorly and ostracized if they were deaf. And so through this, he begins to consider ending his life in this famous letter, but he decides that a true artist suffers for humanity. That's the whole idea and concept of it, and that he would triumph heroically over his ultimate deafness. And frankly, his best works are written when he's totally deaf, by most people's accounts. Now, Bach did go blind and deaf as well as he aged. His sons were musicians, most of them, and so they actually dictated the music that he would call out to them. But Beethoven's greatest achievements are probably when he's deaf. Again, he was a composer, a pianist, and a conductor. His music is highly innovative in its rhythmic drive. You'll notice the difference between Mozart and Beethoven in a lot of ways is that Beethoven has this rhythmic roller coaster intensity that's unpredictable and unstable, and you just don't know where the music's going. It's this endless ride, and it's quite intense. There's also usually a lot of rapidly changing, moving ideas or mood changes and character changes in the music. This week you'll listen to the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. I'll have that tagged in there. This is a revolutionary work. In the last movement, he takes this Enlightenment idea of brotherhood and he joins, really for the first time in history, the choir, which is its own entity associated with the church, and brings them into the orchestra. And so we have vocals and the orchestra together, but only in the last movement, singing one of the most famous, if not the most famous melody of all time. We have the English translations of the poetry underneath. Please watch it. It is long, as you'll find out. It's a long movement of music. It is, frankly, probably Beethoven's gift to humanity. It's one of the greatest artistic achievements of all time, that final movement, and I think you'll enjoy it if you give it the time of day. While you're reading the translation of the text that's being sung, think about the ideas of the Enlightenment. Why are the singers there? Why is there a choir? Why are there soloists? Why are there multiple soloists? Okay, what's going on? What are the Enlightenment principles that are being discussed in the text? How is Beethoven making the music embody that? Beethoven's music falls into 3 time periods. His early works are associated with the classical style of Haydn. Haydn was his teacher. His middle period is signified by this heroic music, this hero story, like in the Third Symphony, Eroica, which was originally supposed to be for Napoleon Bonaparte. And his last works are seen as very introspective. Once he's totally deaf, he really kind of digs into the innerness of his soul and tries to dig out things that he's dealing and grappling with now that the heroic side of him has changed. So the link for this will be under Beethoven in your class announcements. I'm not going to tell you which ones of the Beethoven will be exactly on the listening exam, because I want you to make sure you listen to all of them just like we would in class. So you'll have a list for the classical exam that'll be 1 or 2 songs more than will actually be on the test, just to make sure that hopefully you do not pass up this wonderful opportunity to hear one of the most important works of all time.